Dear colleagues, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world right now. My name is Shiroma Satyapala, Forestry Officer at FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. I am moderating today's webinar. Today's event is jointly organized by the FAO Forestry Division with Regional Forest Invasive Species Networks and the Secretariat of the International Year of Plant Health 2020. COVID-19 has highlighted the importance of preparedness and implementation of preventative measures in order to protect human health. It has also demonstrated that coordinated international action is vital in the management of transboundary diseases. Forest invasive species outbreaks are no different. Coordinated international action is fundamental to protect the world forest from transboundary insect pests, pathogens, invasive vertebrates, and invasive plants. Today's webinar is very significant. This is the first time all FAO Forest Invasive Species networks come together with participants from across the globe to discuss this important issue. We have two objectives of this session. Firstly, to raise regional and global awareness and increase preparedness for future invasive forest pest and disease outbreaks. And secondly, to contribute to the goals of the International Year of Plant Health 2020. Before kicking off, let me share some guidance on how to engage in this webinar. The webinar will be running in English, French, and Russian. The translation will be from English to French and English to Russian. To change the language, please select a language of your choice on the bottom bar. Video and audio functions are disabled for attendees, so you will be able to see us, but we cannot see or hear you. However, you will be able to engage through the question and answer box and the general chat box. For questions, please use the question and answer box. Please indicate the name of the panelist to whom you address your question. We are very keen to hear your insights and thoughts, so please use the general chat for this. It's our great pleasure to present today, and I can see more and more participants are joining. I have to say more than 700 of you have registered for this seminar. So it is really nice to see that you have put aside time to discuss this really important issue. Thank you. The agenda. Opening remarks will be given by Professor Mike Winfield, University of Pretoria, South Africa. This will be followed by presentation from 6 expert panelists. We will then move to question and answer session from the question and answer section, and will wrap up approximately in 90 minutes from now. It is time for me to introduce our guest speaker, Professor Mike Winfield. Mike is the founding director of the Forestry and Agriculture Biotechnology Institute, FABI, in South Africa, and currently serves as an advisor to the executive of the University of Pretoria. From 2014 to 2019, he also served as president of the International Union of Forest Research Organization, or we call it IFRO, which represents over 15,000 forest scientists globally. Mike is internationally recognized for his research on insect pests and disease affecting both plantation forests and natural forest ecosystems. He is particularly concerned with the pathways of movement of tree pests. Mike has published more than 1,000 ISI journal papers in this field. Also, he has advised or co-advised more than 100 PhD students. Mike is a recipient of many awards, and he is the recipient of Kwame Nkrumah Award from the African Union and honorary doctorates from North Carolina State University and the University of British Columbia as well as the China Friendship Award. Now, I am pleased to invite Professor Mike Winfield to give the opening remarks.
Jerome, thank you so much for your kind introduction, and good day to colleagues and friends around the world. It's a special privilege for me to have the opportunity to open this very important webinar today and to consider and speak to the topic of tree health in this important International Year of Plant Health, and specifically to consider what we might learn from the SARS-CoV-2 pandemic that is ravaging the world and the human race today. And for this presentation, I will refer simply to coronavirus as the pathogen, just to make things a little simpler. So to start off, let me share with you a few introductory thoughts. And these are important in terms of making comparisons between the human pathogen, the coronavirus, and its effect on the human race, and then on the forestry environment that we're specifically thinking about today. So one important point to consider in making a comparison between the coronavirus situation and then the tree health environment is the difference between trees and humans, of course. And here I've chosen two pictures from one of my favorite artists, Van Gogh, that incorporate both trees and people. And the point I want to make is that trees and people are really very similar. And I oftentimes say this in lectures, sometimes draws a couple of laughs. But the point that's really important is that trees live for very long periods of time, as do we as human beings. And that means that when we or trees encounter a novel pathogen, and it's usually a pathogen, not an insect pest in this case, they're naive and they have no capacity to deal with the invasion, and the results are catastrophic. Another important issue to consider is the tree environment in which we work, or that we are thinking about. Trees in planted situations, plantations, even in orchards for that matter, are simply trees in natural forests somewhere else in the world. And this picture, I think, illustrates the point very well. You see these fabulous eucalyptus trees growing in the beautiful snowy mountains of Australia, and then a plantation of eucalyptus also having been native in Australia in a natural forest, planted in an intensive plantation environment. And when we consider tree health situations, these environments are actually quite different, at least as we consider opportunities to deal with invasions. And I'd like you to think about that as I continue through this presentation. Another point to consider when dealing with tree health problems, and at least that in the terms of biotic problems, and I'm not in this presentation going to deal with climate issues, simply invasions, and they're caused by biotic organisms. Of course, I'm drawing a comparison between the coronavirus situation and the forestry environment, is that we deal mostly with insects and microbial pathogens, and microbial pathogens mostly, in fact, with fungi. And fungi and insects are incredibly similar. I sometimes jokingly in lectures say you might think of insects simply as fungi with 6 legs, or fungi as insects without legs, and at least that is true from a phylogenetic standpoint. But the way that we deal with invasions of forests by insects and microbial pathogens is very similar in some cases, and it's also very different in others. So let us then make some observations from the coronavirus pandemic and consider some lessons that we might learn from it as we think about the future of tree health globally. An important first point, and this is a strong statement, is that we were warned. We were well warned that the human race is seriously threatened by pathogens and pandemics. And let me illustrate this by another slide, a point that I've made in lectures where Bill Gates, the famous businessman, dealt with this issue relating to the Ebola crisis. So Bill Gates in 2015 produced a perspective paper in the famous New England Journal of Medicine. And what he said in that paper, and I'd encourage you to read it if you haven't, and there's also a TED talk on this topic, that the key point is that the world is not nearly as prepared as it should be for a massive epidemic. He also, and it's a sobering thought, made the point in this presentation that of the 10,000 or so people that tragically died due to Ebola, many of them would not have died if available technologies at that time had been applied. And this is something we really need to think about in terms of tree health issues and invasives too. Another point to consider when thinking about the coronavirus pandemic, where one is dealing with a novel pathogen that has found a naive host in the human race, is that in tree health situations where trees have to encounter or have encountered new pests or pathogens, those are mainly due to accidental introductions. And in more recent years, we've also started to understand the importance of host shifts and changes in pathogens, and I'll get to that point a little bit later. So for the coronavirus, as I'm sure everybody well knows, it is reasonably well understood that the pathogen originated from bats, probably horseshoe bats. It seems that it moved through a secondary host, which probably is pangolins, as you see in this picture. The pathogen has not only moved to humans, but has also moved to other animals, mink, for instance, and I believe that the virus not only affects mink, but humans can be infected from mink, and there is now evidence that domestic cats become infected, although happily so far we have no evidence that I know of that the pathogen can move from domestic cats to humans. But let me now think about the tree health situation in comparison. So as I already said, in epidemic disease, pest problems in forests, we deal mostly with accidental introductions. And I'm just taking one example here. There are, of course, many. I've chosen one that is one that I'm a bit biased about because it comes from my PhD work of pine wilt caused by the pinewood nematode Bursaphalenchus xylophilus, a pathogen that we now know originated in North America, accidentally introduced many years ago into Asia, Japan, especially in the early days, in other countries of Asia, where naive pine hosts have been devastated by the pathogen, which is carried by insect vectors, species mainly of monocomus in the Cerambycidae. Other than accidental introductions of insect pests and pathogens into forestry environments, there are growing numbers of examples that we're encountering of pathogens, and in fact there are also insects that we know have undergone or undergoing genetic change and thus becoming novel pathogens, something akin to the coronavirus. The example that you see here in the slide is of one of the Cryphonectriaceae. They are canker pathogens on native melastomes, Myrtaceae in many parts of the world that are adapting to infect now eucalyptus and other tree species. Another point to consider when drawing comparisons between the coronavirus situation and the tree health situations that we're particularly interested in this webinar is understanding pathways of introduction and the importance of accurate diagnoses. In the case of the coronavirus, we've seen incredible application of pathway analyses, as you see in this slide. From the very beginning of the outbreak in Wuhan to the movement of this pathogen around the world. And we've depended deeply on understanding these pathways of movement to deal with the problem. So much in the same way that we've seen how important it has been to understand the global movement of the coronavirus, the same is also true for insect pests and pathogens of forests. And there have been some excellent studies of this topic in recent years. The slide that I've chosen to share with you is from a study of Alberto Santini, who showed that since 1980, 70% of new pathogen introductions were likely via the live plant trade, and there's some excellent equivalent studies for insects. We've learned from the coronavirus pandemic how important quarantine is. We've also learned that it is very difficult, and we have learned that it can work. For the coronavirus, we have seen many examples of the importance of containment, quarantine, limiting movement across borders and between countries, so-called social distancing, although I prefer to call this physical distancing, testing, for instance, wearing of masks. And in the plant environment, the forest environment, the same is true. Quarantine is incredibly important. It's also incredibly difficult. In this slide, you see inspectors looking through plant material. It's a very difficult task, but I also believe that it can work better, and that new technologies are available to us that will make these efforts even more successful in the future. So another point of significant importance when one thinks about what we might learn from the coronavirus pandemic is how the human race has depended on science, on scientific results to deal with the pandemic and the movement of the pathogen around the world. This is crucially important, and it is worrying also that we see university departments short of funding, in some cases even in terms of microbiology, entomology departments closing, and then knowing how deeply we rely on good science and technology innovation to deal with invasive pests and pathogens that affect our forests. The importance of science and technology has been vividly illustrated in the case of the coronavirus pandemic. How scientists were rapidly able to identify the pathogen, sequence its genome, and establish an understanding of change in the pathogen as it moves around the world. And likewise for pests and pathogens affecting the health of forests around the world, there are incredible technologies available to enable us to understand, to identify these organisms accurately. That's been a problem in the past. To understand how they're moving, to improve our efforts at quarantine and so forth. And this picture you see in this slide is just one illustration from some of our work at the metagenomics level to enable us to understand what we are moving around the world that we have been unaware of in the past. So again, I feel it's incredibly important that we engage in these technologies, introduce these technologies to enable us to improve the future health of forests. So another point that has been emphasized so strongly in terms of the coronavirus pandemic is the importance of education, and it's education of people in all walks of life. Also, the importance of scientists informing policymakers with solid and reliable information. So what we seek to have and must promote as strongly as possible is evidence-based policy making. This is one of our great responsibilities, and it is great that the FAO has organized this webinar because that is part of this very process. In the case of the coronavirus pandemic, we've seen worrying examples of fake news, of inaccurate information being spread around the world, and this really has continues to frustrate our options to deal with this terrible problem. Likewise, in the forest environment, we need to work as hard as we possibly can to ensure that politicians, policymakers are well informed and that information that is shared with them is accurate and meaningful. Thus, in terms of conveying accurate information and knowledge to governments and policymakers, we depend on important organizations such as, for instance, the FAO that has organized this webinar. UFRO is another organization that plays a hugely important role in informing policymakers as to what is important in terms of research that impacts on the future health of forests. Another point that has come across very clearly for the coronavirus pandemic is that there are no silver bullets, there are no magic cures. And that, of course, is also true when we have an invasion of a natural forest by a new pest or pathogen. So once an insect, pest or a pathogen is accidentally introduced into a natural forest situation, the consequences are usually quite devastating, and there are few solutions to be found, at least not easily. The example I've taken here is of white pine blister rust, which has devastated pines in North America for many years. The situation in a planted forest environment is rather different. There are many opportunities to deal with pest and pathogen problems, including invasives, alien invasives. The picture you see here is of eucalyptus in Southeast Asia in the foreground, Acacia mangium in the background, seriously affected, dying due to infection by a fungal pathogen. The point here is that in the planted forest environment, we don't have medicines, but we have chemicals that can be used in certain circumstances. We also have the opportunity to change what is planted, and in the future we will see the application of other new technologies, including, for instance, genetic modification of the tree. So that's a very specialized situation, and that is perhaps something to think about in comparing the coronavirus situation and the tree health situation. And for insect pests, we have biological control as one of the opportunities to deal with new invasions and insect pest problems. There are many examples, and we'll see more in the future, I believe. In the slide here, you see the beautiful insect Gonypteris platensis in Colombia, a nice photograph by Carlos Rodas. And the background picture is a celebration, and it's a celebration of biological control in South Africa. The first biological control in the forestry environment ever was the introduction of the parasitoid Anaphes nitens into South Africa for the control of another Gonypteris species, currently known as Gonypteris species 2. And the last point I want to share in this brief introduction to the webinar is the incredible importance of collaboration and communication between scientists. This is hugely important, and it is also true and has been true for the coronavirus pandemic. In terms of collaboration, we emphasized this point very strongly in a paper in Science a few years ago, considering, of course, the planted forest environment. And we called in this paper for a global strategy to deal with invasions of insect pests and pathogens. And emphasizing the importance of collaborations, I've chosen this slide put together by colleagues in FABI, which illustrates global collaboration for us. And I'd like to take the opportunity particularly to thank the many participants in this webinar that are included in our collaborations around the world. This slide shows collaborations based on co-publications or joint publications with colleagues. And as a research team focused on tree health issues, we depend very deeply on these collaborations. And one could have exactly the same picture, I know, from the labs of many of the participants in this webinar, so the point would not be down in South Africa, somewhere else in the world, connecting other parts of the world. But these collaborations are truly essential to all of us. I emphasize the word collaborate and make the point that global problems, such as those that we deal with in terms of tree health, require global solutions. So colleagues, thank you so much again for listening to me, and thanks again to FAO, Sharoma and your team for putting together this important webinar. And let me just make one final point. The final point that I want to make is that there is a huge amount that we can learn from the coronavirus pandemic. It's an awful situation that the world is having to deal with, but unfortunately there are also terrible situations in terms of the health of forests, relating to invasions of pests and pathogens, and I've not dealt with the issues of climate change, for instance, but that is, of course, an important component of this problem. We should take as much learning as we can from the coronavirus pandemic and do the very best we can to preserve the forests of the world. It is so often forgotten that we depend on the forests of the world for food security, for the air that we breathe, and the water that we drink. And I leave you with these final words, apparently a Zen proverb, but there are other claimants to these words, that it takes a wise person to learn from his or her mistakes, but an even wiser person to learn from the mistakes of others. So thank you so much for your attention, and I look forward to enjoying the other presentations in this webinar and the discussions that will go with them.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you for the excellent explanation, and also linking the COVID-19 and also the forest pests and disease outbreaks. You are indeed a global ambassador for forest health. Now I would like to explain a little bit what FAO Forestry Division is doing. We assist, advises, and supports countries to address the global issue of forest invasive species. We also facilitate the regional forest invasive species networks. There are currently 4 active regional networks in the Asia Pacific, Africa, Europe and Central Asia, and the Near East region. Altogether, these networks cover close to 100 countries. They aim to foster the exchange of information, mobilization of resources to raise the regional awareness and act as a link between experts and stakeholders concerned with forest invasive species. I know because of COVID-19, we cannot physically travel. Now let's take a virtual journey to these regions. Our first stop is the Europe and Central Asia region, where I am pleased to introduce the Regional Network Coordinator, Professor Ferenc Lakatos. Ferenc is a professor at the University of Sopron, Hungary, Faculty of Forestry, Institute of Silviculture and Forest Protection. His main areas of interest are bark and wood-boring insects, invasion biology, and forest protection. Through his work, he promotes the cooperation between various national and international institutions, organizations, decision makers, and the broader public on issues of forest invasive species. Ferenc, please tell us about the network and your thoughts on how can community involvement play a role in preventing the spread of invasive species. Ferenc, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Roma. And thank you very much for the possibility to give you a short introduction about the network and to make some slides about the panel question I have. I hope you can see my screen. So the Forest Invasive Species Network for Europe and Central Asia established in 2017, so 3 years ago, after an initiative from several countries and the regional office of FAO. We have 4 thematic areas: microorganisms, invertebrates, vertebrates, and plants. At the moment, we have 27 member countries, but still increasing. So, and we set several objectives for the network. Most important of them are promote the share of information to coordinate the activities on forest invasive species, raise awareness in the management of all the species. In many cases, we get requests for taxonomic support from the member institutions and member countries, and we try to serve as a communication link for all levels and for all countries. We had already a few meetings and a certain number of trainings in various fields. What I would like to highlight is that our webpage is bilingual, so you can find all our information both in English and Russian available there. So my panel question is, how can community involvement play a role in preventing the spread of invasive species? Even if Mike have already highlighted a few points of it, I would like to go more into detail in this case a little bit. So what is the relationship of the people to the forest invasive species? I think the first group we can call the professionals. They are working at various international and national organizations like FAO, IPPC, EPO, and several other organizations. So their main aim is to work with forest invasive species. The second group, I would say they are directly affected by the profession. They are working in another field like forest owners, forest managers, gardeners, nursery operators, and many other ones, but they definitely have certain issues and certain experience with forest invasive species already. But in my view, the most important group of people is the next one. They are, I would say, indirectly affected by the private life mainly. So they are house or garden owners, hikers, bikers, nature lovers. So various groups of people, they are interested in plants, sometimes in insects, and in forest in general. And of course, we have also a large group of people who are not really interested in forest invasive species at all. But I would like to concentrate on the third group. So how all these interested people can play a role in preventing of the spread of forest invasive species. So we should start already prior to the introduction. So to explain for the broader audience the role of travel and trade in the introduction of species. So on this map, you can see the major ship routes around the globe. So this is a rather heavy amount of goods going from one continent to the other. And of course, you need a clear and easily understandable information to reduce the introduction and to reduce the further expansion of invasive species. After the introduction, you still can rely on the broader audience. So there are several applications for smartphones or tablets where you can use in the field for monitor the distribution or even the range expansion of the forest invasive species, or even control your own property if you have some, or even to use it in the close neighborhood, in the community area. So the locals are always engaged to be involved in these activities. What do we need to have a much more effective involvement here? So the information sharing is needed using broadly accessible sources. So without any restrictions, any registration fee for various platforms. Of course, we as professionals have to disseminate all of the state-of-the-art knowledge into a way to the broader audience that they will understand it and they can use it. And of course, all these networks, in my view, needs to act as a link between the various institutions, national and internationals, between the various levels, ministry, local government, or even community, or even between various interest groups we have. And of course, we need reliable and approved information, which can be distributed via online and even offline media. Sometimes a local newspaper brings much more information to the local community than the online medias like Facebook or even Twitter. And as a large slide of my presentation, I would like to show one example from my home country, the range expansion of the box-tree moth. So this species was first found in our botanical garden at our campus in 2012. And after that, we started a webpage campaign to ask all the members of the countries, all the citizens of the country to provide us information if they found the species in their own garden. And we got several thousand responders, several thousand reports. So for the 2013, you can see already both the natural range expansion of the species, but also the human assisted ones. So in the middle of the country, in our capital Budapest, but even in the northeastern part. And the next year, 2014, a much larger area already. And 2015 and 2016, the species already spread across the entire territory of the country. So I hope this short overview was useful for you to understand how important is to the involvement of the broader public to combat all the, to reduce the spread and, to combat the effects of all forest invasive species in our region at least. And here I would like to thank you for your attention and spasiba za wasze wнимание. Thank you.
Thank you, Ferenc. We heard the call to increase the community involvement in preventing the spread of invasive species. Now, I would like you all to participate in a small poll on your screen. The question is, how effectively do you think community involvement is used in your country to manage forest invasive species? Please click your answer on the screen. So I can see very interesting results. Actually, we have more than 400 attendees today, and then I can see about 37% sitting average and 38% is saying it's poor. And it seems we have a lot of work to do in this area. Thank you for sharing the results. Now, I would like to continue our journey. Now we are heading to Asia Pacific, where we have two coordinators for this network. First, I would like to invite Professor Simon Lawson. Simon Lawson is in the Forest Health Division at the University of Sunshine Coast, Australia, and he's the Director of the Biological Control of Eucalyptus Pest Alliance, or BICEP. Prior to joining USC, he was the leader for forest health research in the Queensland Department of Agriculture and Fisheries. Simon's research focus is plantation forest, insect pests, and with emphasis on biological control. He also has strong interest in forest biosecurity and population modeling. Simon will tell us about the network activities and address the question, how can surveillance network enhance preparedness for future pandemic? Simon, take it away.
Thank you very much, Roma. I hope you can see my screen with any luck. Okay. So the Asia Pacific Forest Invasive Species Network, I think, is the oldest of our networks, established in 2004. We have 34 member countries of the Asia Pacific Forestry Commission, covering pretty much half of the globe. So we're a very diverse network. We have 5 objectives in our network. The first is to raise awareness. Second is to exchange and share information. The third one is to facilitate access to expertise and technical knowledge and policies. The fourth one is to strengthen capacities. And Jianghua, the other coordinator of the network, in the next presentation will talk about some of the capacity building efforts that have occurred at FISM over the last few years. And the fifth objective is about developing strategies for management of forest invasive species. So we also have a website at appfism.net. You can visit there, you can sign up for a monthly newsletter, and we also have a presence on Twitter. You can follow us there if you want to as well. So the question I have been challenged with today is, can surveillance networks enhance preparedness for future pandemics? The quick answer is yes. So if you want to go and grab a coffee, now is a good time to go and have a coffee or tea. But if you want to hang around, let's continue on. So we can think of biosecurity as a continuum. So we have, across from left to right, we have pre-border, border, and post-border. And in those boxes, you can see a number of different activities that are undertaken essentially with the aim. You can see that on the left, before the border, there's a high risk of avian invasive species moving into a country. And if we carry out a lot of these activities along that continuum, hopefully on the right, you'll see that the risk is lowered. So in terms of surveillance and biosecurity, surveillance and preparedness, if we just highlight some of those activities. So surveillance, much of the surveillance happens post-border, but also pre-border in terms of collaborative surveillance and monitoring. And then there are a whole lot of other preparedness activities at all parts of the biosecurity continuum. So we should define terms. So what is surveillance? Well, it's a systematic process for detecting pests, recording the results and reporting the data. That data provides information on the distribution, incidence and severity of pests and diseases. Monitors change, can be used to monitor change in forest health status over time. It assists in detecting, containing or eradicating new pests and diseases. Also, in the commercial sphere, it assists in market access by providing area freedom data. And also, increasingly, surveillance is a required part of a sustainability certification, such as FSC and PFC. So defining another term, what is preparedness? Preparedness is really a state of readiness. And there are a number of things that actions that we might take to be prepared, to be ready for new pests and diseases. And as I run through these, I'll comment on whether surveillance has some relevance, some importance to these activities. So in forest biosecurity, preparedness includes import risk analysis, and yes, surveillance feeds into that. It also includes pest risk analysis and priority pest lists, and surveillance feeds into that. Includes contingency planning, and you're getting the message, I think, by now that surveillance does fit into contingency planning. Early detection, diagnosis, reporting, decision-making, cost-sharing, coordinated management, and stakeholder and community engagement, all things that surveillance can fit into. So with the Australian Centre for International Agricultural Research and APFISM, we're developing a joint project, a collaborative project in Southeast Asia for a biosecurity network. We know that low-income countries are the most vulnerable to the impacts of invasive species, have the least capacity to manage them. And also the capability to detect and respond to these incursions is very crucial to minimise impacts. We also know that the capacity varies a lot among countries in our region, but there's a general lack of preparedness. And so we need a coordinated strengthened forest biosecurity capacity in Southeast Asia for the future health of our forests. So the aim of this project we're developing is to better integrate forestry with existing biosecurity and agriculture. There's a lot of work already done in agriculture that forestry does not necessarily tap into. Building capacity in pest risk analysis, surveillance and diagnostics, and integrating this into policy development in the region for more effective policy. So we hope this project will start in January next year. We have 6 initial countries as members, and there is a partner ACR project that's developing the science to support that network. So thank you, and I'll hand back to Shiroma.
Thank you, Simon. It is always challenging to get national commitments for preparedness activities. Impacts of COVID-19 hopefully will open many eyes to increase the national commitments. Now, we would like you to participate in another poll. The question is, how effectively do you think surveillance networks are used in your country to enhance preparedness for future invasions of forest pests? Very interesting results. The 14% said excellence and 37% said poor. Sorry, 6% said excellent and 37% said poor and 32% said average. So again, here I think we have a lot more to do than what we are doing now. So now, thank you for the poll, for participation. Now, on our virtual tour, we are still in Asia Pacific, and our next presenter is Professor Jianghua Sun, coordinator of Asia Pacific Forest Invasive Species Network. Professor Jianghua Sun is a distinguished professor of entomology with Institute of Zoology, Chinese Academy of Sciences. Currently, he also serves as Deputy Director for the State Laboratory of Integrated Management of Pests, Insects and Rodents. Jianghua's research interest is focused on interactions among host plants, herbivores, and their associated fungi and bacteria. The work employs study of invasion biology of invasive species in Asia and the development of semiochemical based monitoring and control technologies. Jianghua, please tell us about your network activities and how we can enhance the resilience of our forests to climate change and pest outbreaks. Jianghua, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Shruma, for the introduction. Also, many thanks for the audience. As Simon already introduced our network in his talk, here I will highlight some capacity building activities by our network in Asia-Pacific region. Those recent Asia-Pacific Forest Invasive Species Network capacity building activities, including the establishment of biological control facilities and the program to control coconut leaf beetle in Maldives, and the China-Vietnam cross-border cooperative study on polyphagous shortboard in 2015. A number of international training workshops that included a workshop on forest invasive pests in 2016, developing skill in forest protection, integrated approach in Beijing 2018, a Panwood nematode workshop on how in science and inform policy in South Korea 2019. And we also have planned a workshop on Panwood nematode ID detection and management in Nanjing, China for next year. And the question is, how do we enhance the resilience of our forest to climate change and the pest outbreak? Climate change clearly impacts the forest invasive species. Climate change alters, for one, means of transport and introduction of forest invasive species. Secondly, establishment of new forest invasive species. Thirdly, impact of existing invasive species. And fourth, distribution of existing forest invasive species. Fifth, effectiveness of control strategy. And lastly, distribution of native species, which can cause range expansion that makes some native species become invasive species. The red figure on the slides is one example of native undergoing climate change driving range expansion becoming invasive. Is the mountain pine beetle in North America. It has expanded north and eastwards more than 300 kilometers in Canada, and the populations may eventually invade the eastern North American pine forest. Another example of range expansion of native is the pine procession moth in Europe. The caterpillars are active in winter, and the climate change, particularly global warming, cause the range expansion. Although summer heat waves make the news, it is important to note that winter active species are affected more by global warming because winter temperatures are relatively more increased. This is particularly evident in the past 40 years in France. See right up ahead the figure, and moth distribution is expanding north and eastwards throughout Europe. See low right. Forecast models predict expansion based on the severity of global warming. Climate change makes forests less resistant and also disturbance. Left side of figure shows enhanced forest resilience. Note the deep slope and the steep slope show high resilience to disturbance. Keep the forest indicated by the black circle in a steady state. On the right side of the figure, climate change reduces forest resilience. Note the shallow slope, making forest more susceptible and less resilient to disturbance. Example of disturbance are: one, novel disturbance. Secondly, increase the disturbance size, frequency, and severity. Thirdly, their combined effect. Lower resilience may cause an unhealthy forest to change. This is the critical point or tipping point that changes the original forest into a new forest or non-forest habitat. Focus question: how do we enhance the resilience of our forest to climate change and the pest outbreak? See upper right figure. Higher resilience enables the forest to stay in a healthy state despite increased tree stress and forest disturbance. Main figure: enhanced forest resilience can be achieved by a proactive strategy. This means starting with a healthy natural forest ecosystem with baseline ecological data gathered. This strategy focuses on enhanced biodiversity, increased species diversity, and function group diversity. Secondly, use of early intervention tools, which helps facilitate management plan to minimize the impact of forest invasive species. Otherwise, a restoration strategy With late intervention, aggressive pest outbreak control measures or impaired ecosystem is used to try to attempt to recover the ecosystem. Both strategies can result in a functional ecosystem in the presence of forest invasive species. However, a proactive strategy that enhances forest resilience is preferred. With that, I conclude my talk today, and also, again, many thanks to the audience. Thank you.
Thank you, Jianghua, for excellent explanation about the importance of enhancing resilience of forests to face future pest outbreaks and impact of climate change. Now, let's jump a few thousand kilometers to a region with much less forest cover, the Near East region. I would like to introduce coordinator for the Near East Forest Health and Invasive Species Network, Professor Mohammed Habib Benjama. Benjama is the General Director of Plant Health and Quarantine at the Ministry of Agriculture, Water Resources and Fisheries in Tunisia. He is the national focal point of the IPPC in Tunisia. He's co-leading the working group on integrated pest management in oak forests within International Organization of Biological Control. He also the deputy coordinator of the IFRO working group on entomological research in Mediterranean forest ecosystems. Benjama, please provide us a brief overview of the network and share your views on how can we increase national and regional capacity building. Benjama, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Shiroma. Good morning, everybody. I will share with you my presentation. I will speak about the Near East Network on Forest Health and Invasive Species, which is established in 2007. We have now 9 member countries. The region is characterized by semi-arid to desert condition with a scarce forest cover. The water is scarcity, coupled with climate change impact, in particular for challenge for the NENA region. The forest health capacity of countries were characterized by 2 things. At the technical level, the national forest monitoring and assessments is not well developed, and at the institutional level, we have a lack of institution and department in charge of forest health and invasive species. Here we are, the main insect invasive species in the NENA region. As you see, the majority were linked to the eucalyptus, which is introduced from Australia. But what is of interest is the arrival of natural enemies. So population is so controlled. We have the dangerous invasive species, Leptoglossus occidentalis, which is detected in Tunisia and Lebanon. Now we have a new invasive species, Dactyloplus opuntiae, which is detected in Lebanon, Morocco, Jordan, and Palestine, and attack the cactus plants, Opuntia ficus indica. Why this insect is very dangerous? Because the picklipere has an important role in our region, which can develop in the semi-arid and arid area, resistance to drought. It plays an essential role in the desertification control, plays an essential role in the conservation of the biological diversity. Barberry figs fruits constitute additional income sources for farmers of the region. It is also used as forage for the regional semi-arid animals. This new invasive species has become a big concern for the picklipere production in different countries, and an eradication program should be implemented. So our question in this presentation is, how can we nationally, regionally, globally work together to build capacity? At the nationally level, we must establish technical working group to share coordinated awareness raising activity with MPPO and other institutions, evaluation of impact of climate change on pest and disease management, assessment of risk of new introduction of invasive alien species, increase the resilience of forest toward pest outbreaks using sustainable forest management. At the regional level, countries within the region must to collaborate on training and sharing information, joint scientific research on common invasive species, implement regional surveillance activities. And at the globally level, we must cross-sectoral, private and public, production, travel, transport, cooperation and coordination on prevention activities. Coordinated mechanism for critical research between regions, establishment of information system, as well as training programs targeting best practice for management and forest invasive species. Before the end of the presentation, I would say that we have a global action here in the region, mainly sustainable management of the fall armyworm in Africa. So I asked the IPPC member, Adriana Moreira, and the Forest Division to work together to have a common action globally, regionally, to manage it, to manage and control Dactylopleus opunsi. And thank you very much. Merci et shukran.
To Benjama, and also we would very like to take your advice to work together to combat the fall armyworm and the cactus pests. And also thank you for explaining what we should do to improve forest health capacities nationally, regionally, and globally. Now, I would like to invite you to our last but very important poll on pest management. The question is, how do you think your country is performing on the use of environmentally friendly measures to manage forest invasive species? Please click the button of your choice. Very interesting results. 35% says average, and 4% have excellent, and then 29% it says poor. So again, we can see that in this area also we need to work harder to implement environmentally friendly measures to manage forest invasive species. Thank you for participation. Last but certainly not least, the final stop of our virtual journey is Africa. I would like to introduce now Professor Brett Hurley, Coordinator for Forest Invasive Species Network for Africa, or we call it FISNA. Brett is a research leader at the Forestry and Agricultural Biotechnology Institute, FABI, and he also a professor at the University of Pretoria in South Africa. Brett's research focuses on insect pests of plantation forestry and integrated pest management programs, including biocontrol. He is also the coordinator of the IPRO Working Party, Biological Control of Forest Insect Pests and Pathogens. Brett will now share the network activities and insights on what are environmentally friendly measures to manage invasive species. Brett, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Shiroma, for the introduction. I'm just going to share my screen. Okay, just to confirm, can you hear me and see the presentation?
We can see here and we can see the presentation.
Okay, great. So thank you for the introduction. As mentioned, I'm based at FABI, the Forestry and Agricultural Biotechnology Institute at the University of Pretoria, and I'm currently the coordinator for FISNA, which is the Forest Invasive Species Network for Africa. Similar to the other networks, this network, really the main aim of the network is to coordinate the dissemination of information on invasive species as well as their management. You can go to the website if you want some more information, and my email is also on the website. FISNA was established in 2004. We currently have about 10 active country members, but we're looking to increase that in the near future. So today I was asked to speak about environmentally friendly measures that can be used to manage forest invasive species. And of course, there's a number of such measures, but I'm going to be focusing on the use of biological control. So as I'm not familiar with the audience attending this webinar, I'm just going to give a quick introduction to the concept of biocontrol and what exactly I'm referring to. So as you can see from the diagram, the idea would be that you have an insect pest. In this case, we're talking about invasive insect species of forests, and they would have a direct negative effect on trees and therefore on forests. In the case of invasive species, this is often because they're introduced to a new environment and then they're exposed to trees that are susceptible, and they also don't have their natural enemies that are introduced with them that would normally regulate or reduce those populations. So the idea behind biological control is that we introduce or increase the numbers of natural enemies. That could be a predator or a parasitoid, as shown on this figure, but it could actually be something like an entomopathogen or another species as well. So any natural enemy is introduced. That has a direct negative effect on the pest species, and therefore an indirect positive effect on increasing tree health in the forest. So that's the general concept of biological control that I'm going to be referring to. So is biological control an effective or feasible approach to use to manage forest invasive species? I think it is, and in many cases it's actually the best option. So as you can see from this figure that is from a recent publication, biological control is actually more successful in forest systems or to control forest insect pests than it is for agricultural pests in general. So there's actually a significantly greater number of cases where the target pest has been controlled when it's been a forest insect pest. As you can also see from this figure, though, it's about 1 in every 3 cases that the target pest has been controlled in a forest biocontrol program. So there's obviously room for improvement, although this is actually not such a bad statistic if you consider that those pests now have long-term management with little further input that's needed, and also the great contribution that those programs have made to reducing the use of pesticides that would most likely otherwise have been used. But now just to come back to network objectives. So these are some of the FISNA objectives, but they're very similar, as you would have picked up, to some of the other network objectives. And it's basically around exchanging information, building capacity, providing links, and also technical guides and policy advice. So with regards to biocontrol and how these objectives have played out in biocontrol, we've in the last couple of years had a number of workshops. This is one of the workshops that happened recently at Future Africa at the University of Pretoria, where there were about 15 different countries involved. And this was around discussions and sharing expertise in how to implement biocontrol in the sub-Saharan African region. These workshops also have included practical demonstrations. So for example, here's a demonstration of how to do post-release monitoring after natural enemies have been released to identify both the pest and the natural enemies using different trap types. Another objective, an output, this is not so much a FISNA output, but actually from the FAO, but including or involving members from the different networks. And this is a guide to the classical biocontrol of insect pests implanted in natural forests. And this again shows the importance of biocontrol as a strategy to manage invasive pests in forests. So this guide was specifically developed or targeted at forest practitioners to implement or to provide them with tools to implement biocontrol strategies, specifically in developing countries where this expertise might not otherwise exist. Okay, so just to start wrapping up, so I've been talking about biocontrol, but biocontrol is actually quite a big topic, and there's different forms of biocontrol. So augmentative biocontrol is involving the mass release, mass production and mass release of biocontrol agents. And this is an area where we need to start putting more attention in the region and developing the capacity to do this. So a good example is for the Syrinx wood wasp. So you see on the left, all those flasks is to produce nematodes to control the Syrinx wood wasp, but we can do this with a lot of other forest pests as well. We just need to develop the capacity and expertise to do that. Another area that we need to pay more attention to is the use of natural biocontrol. So this is where there's actually native natural enemies in the system that can be used to control insect pests. This is done well in some countries, but there's a lot more work we can do around this. This is an example of using entomopathogenic nematodes to control white grubs, where actually the native or the local strains are performing better than the commercial strains. And then we also need to be more clever in forms of biocontrol, such as conservation biocontrol, which is actually where you just alter the environment where the pest has been introduced so that you favor the natural enemies, either those that you've introduced yourself or those that are already occurring in that environment. All of these forms of biocontrol really take an in-depth understanding of the biology and ecology of the systems, which is why we're so reliant on developing strong research capacity to support these programs in tree health. So for that, I just want to close with this photo, which brings us back to one of the first presentations of Ferenc about community involvement. So here we see on your right-hand side, a lady who's a farmer in the area, this is in Zimbabwe, who's been taught about biocontrol and releasing biocontrol agents to control pests on a eucalyptus stand. And now she's actually teaching her neighboring farmers about this strategy. And basically spreading the word about how this can be used. So with that, I would just like to close off, and thank you very much, Jerome.
Thank you very much, Brett, for the very insightful presentation. It shows that biological control is not rocket science, and with the community involvement, we can actually promote use of biological control to combat the forest invasive species. Next, I'm pleased to introduce a colleague, Dr. Adriana Moreira from International Plant Protection Convention, or IPPC. Adriana is Standard Setting Officer in IPPC Secretariat and the lead for the technical panel on diagnostic protocols. Adriana coordinates the work of the Standards Committee, the IPPC technical panels, and IPPC expert working groups, which have the objective of drafting international standards for phytosanitary measures, or we call ISPMs. Before joining the IPPC and FAO, Adriana was a senior plant pathologist at multinational seed industry in Brazil. Adriana, please tell us, what are the current initiative of IPPC to increase awareness of pest prevention and enhance resilience of forests? Over to you, Adriana.
Thank you very much, Shiroma. Thank you very much for everyone. Firstly, we know that plant pests are appearing earlier and in places that we've never seen before. And the IPPC is a plant health convention, as Shiroma put it there. It's also an integral part of the forest sector. And pest prevention is better than pest control. Implementing and following the IPPC international standards when setting national or regional phytosanitary measures are indispensable for plant health. As we are aware, right now and seeing with the COVID-19 pandemic, application of science-based preventive actions, including quarantine measures to contain invasive pests, are indispensable to protect the health of people, animals, and also plants. All actions need joint efforts. That's my wording. At global, regional, and national level, as already stressed here. And the forest sector and the national plant protection organizations need more than ever to work together in true collaboration. Well, one example is the implementation of IPPC standards, which is dependent on collaboration of all sectors. As for example, for forest-related international standards, we have the example of ISPM 15 on the wood packaging material and ISPM 39 on the international movement of wood. The IPPC also has some phytosanitary treatments and diagnostic protocols specific to pests related to forest. And for 2020, we have in our work program the development of a guide to help with the implementation of ISPM 15 on the wood packaging material. Several other fronts are also in the IPPC pipeline, and the forest sector is definitely a key player, as the IPPC has a new strategic framework. For example, the IPPC is assessing the impacts of climate change in plant health. The IPPC is studying and trying to coordinate a pest outbreak and alert response system and a diagnostic laboratory networking. And of course, this year, 2020 is the International Year of Plant Health. And we hope that our increase our awareness about the importance of plant health, the importance of pest prevention. And for this time, it's important to remember that a threat to plant health is also a threat to the health and prosperity of people, especially the most vulnerable ones. And again, prevention is better than a cure. And this is the noble goal for which the IPPC was created. And it's reflected in the YIPH slogan, protecting plants, protecting life. Again, all actions need joint efforts. We do not do it alone, but together. The IPPC and FAO Forest, all the forest sector and NPPOs can help with increased awareness on pest prevention and enhance resilience of forests. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Adriana. It is a very good explanation and saying what are the activities currently happening with IPPC related to forestry. Now it is time to answer some of your questions. I can see many questions, but please understand we may not be able to answer all the questions, but we will prepare all the questions and we'll put it on our FAO Forest Health website. So one of the questions I just want to ask is to Mike Winfield. Mike, yes, the question is from Raja Rishi, and he's asking whether it is true the globalization has increased international trade and movement of seeds and planting material has enhanced the risk of introduction of invasive species.
Thank you very much for the question, and thank you for rereading it. I was not able to answer on I don't have a keyboard that I can do this with, but the answer is of course. There are huge numbers of studies, there are a lot of data that show that a driving factor is in fact globalization and the movement of people. One just has to look at the numbers of planes. Now, of course, we're in a different situation now, but pre the coronavirus pandemic, one just has to look at the number of planes and ships moving around the world. I mean, we know that the area has been almost overfull. So, yeah, just absolutely, it's a key part of the problem that we're dealing with, and it is likely not a problem that's going away.
Thank you very much, Mike. Also, I will select another question. This is the question is about more about the survival characteristic. Again, Mike, the question is to you. It seems to be you are very popular. So the question is from Shams Uddin, and is asking, due to more survival characteristic, the government and people are planting exotic species like acacia and eucalyptus. but exotic plant species are serious threat to biodiversity and wildlife in Bangladesh. What is your suggestion?
Yeah, look, I mean, you're raising, and I thank you for the question, you're raising a very controversial issue, and it's one that really deserves a webinar of its own, a debate. The plant, you know, there are many ways of thinking about planting non-native species. We rely on them very deeply for products, but there are also negative sides of this. Planting native species is in fact also a problem, and we know that many areas where native species have been planted, they've been devastated by pests and pathogens, because the native pests and pathogens, of course, identify them. It's a complex question, and one that I'd be happy to enter into a debate on, and I'm sure other panelists also. But it's important that we think about this issue, and I'm going to leave it at that, because otherwise I'll get into a very long discussion.
Thank you very much, Mike. Now, I think we have a request to share all poll results. Because we have limited time, I think we didn't show all the poll results to you properly. So I would suggest to look at those ones, because this is really interesting, because we had more than 400 participants. I think this is one of the best, first time we got together from all over the regions who are working in forest health. So it is good to look at your opinion on this. Let's have a look at this. It's very interesting. I think this will allow us to use these results. We will be able to use for our future work. I now invite Chief of the FAO Forestry Division, Tina Vahanen. Tina is the Chief of the Forestry Division. Previously, she has led FAO work on REDD+ and National Forest Monitoring. Tina also worked on international forest and natural resources policy issues at FAO since 2001 and led the organization of the 14th World Forestry Congress in 2015, where there were about 5,000 participants. She has coordinated FAO's contribution to the global climate change debates, notably UNFCCC, and managed FAO forestry contribution to other international agreements and collaborative partnership on forests. Tina, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Shiroma, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending where you are, distinguished colleagues and distinguished experts. This webinar has been very interesting to me, particularly since I'm not an expert on invasive species, and I have certainly learned a lot. And as it has been pointed out many times, as we are now seeing with the COVID-19 pandemic, there's an increasing threat of forest invasive species to the health, sustainability, and productivity of forests globally. And of course, it's not only a threat to forests, it's actually a threat to people and the environment as a whole. So insect pest outbreaks damage about 30 million hectares of forests annually, and currently invasive species are the second most important reason for biodiversity loss in many countries after the habitat loss. So I heard also that today's webinar highlighted the urgent need for more collaboration on cross-border efforts. Really, the invasive species, pests, insects, outbreaks, they don't respect any borders of any national borders. So cross-border efforts and work is extremely important. And we clearly need to improve country capacities, at the local level capacities to apply environmentally friendly measures and implement the phytosanitary measures in forestry. And I think many of the colleagues, particularly the coordinators of the regional networks, emphasized the importance of the enhanced communication. We working in the forestry sector are not very famous for good communication, so there's plenty of room to enhance that. And just to conclude from my side, I think really it is important that we, all of us, collectively must ensure that our forests are resilient to threats from invasive species. This will require strengthening of activities for prevention, for early detection, for public awareness, and the implementation of effective and environmentally responsible management measures. And of course, the coordination between different levels and actors is crucial. And we are facing a considerable challenge, not only the COVID-19 pandemic, but obviously the increasing climate change. This will require even more support from science and technology to find innovative measures. Forest invasive species and climate change are global problems, truly global problems. And these global problems require global solutions customized to local conditions. Finally, let me also note that the work of the invasive species networks and all of you, the experts around the world, your work is really crucial in contributing to the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals. So the work is not only important at the scientific institutions or at the national level, but really contributing the overall Sustainable Development Goals, in particular the Goal 15, the Life on Land, and especially its target 15.8, that calls for measures to prevent the introduction of and significantly reduce the impact of invasive alien species. Let me conclude here, and I really would like to thank you from my side for all of your participation, for your contributions. Specifically, my regards to Professor Mike Wingfield, that we worked together last time with the previous World Forestry Congress. Thank you for your opening remarks, and all the other panelists and coordinators, in particular of the regional networks. And thank you to Shiroma also for your excellent facilitation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tina, for your excellent concluding remarks and connecting our work on forest invasive species with United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. As time is coming to an end, I thank our speakers, our guest speaker, Mike Winfield, all supporting hands behind the scenes, the technician, the interpreters, and especially Federica Urbani and Eliko Bugio for their fantastic support in preparing this event. And of course, a big thank you to all participants for joining us today. So I wish you a very good evening or the rest of the day today. Stay safe. Goodbye.